let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the podcast where we talk about gaming, feedism, and everything in its orbit. I'm James.
And I'm Tim. So let's get into it. Today we are kind of doing a little bit of a succession to the bonus episode where we did 20 years of hard fat. We've decided that we are actually going to start reviewing different media that involves weight gain or gaining, feederism, chubby chasing, BBW. And we actually just watched a little documentary called Fat Girls and Feeders, which was filmed in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? Yeah.
That's right. It was directed by Alastair Cook and Robert Davis. Now, I'm not sure what channel this originally aired on, but the narrator was a British woman, so we can assume this may have been done for Channel 4 here in the UK, and they do tend to do documentaries exploring different topics. But yeah. How do I want to start this off?
I don't know if you guys can tell from the tone of our voices, but we have a lot to say about this.
So look, I want to make this point first and foremostly, right? So something we have said on the podcast before is historically, shit that has to do with gaining and feedism is not great. And this documentary follows suit. I'm not going to lie to you all. It doesn't feel great to watch.
Yeah.
It's very aggravating, if I'm honest, because... Look,
it's a very I said to you, it's a predatory documentary.
It's extremely predatory, right? And I just... there's a lot of sentiments that are just wrong. Like, factually wrong. But you know what? It's a review, so we're going to get... we're going to go through it, all right? So let's just do this. So we watched it. Before the film actually begins, it showcases a title card, which we discover is the commercial intro and outro for the documentary, and it showcases one of the main characters, Gina, who I believe at this point is approaching like 850 pounds or something like that. She's sitting in the nude, sitting on the edge of her bed with this, like, weird smile frozen on her face. Even from this initial glance, right, what impression did you get from the documentary at this point?
I thought, okay, the pose that she's sitting in, the way it's framed, the very strange, the really weird smile on her face. I don't know what she was being told to do in this shot. Like, I don't know what her director told her to do, but like, it presented itself like the circus fat lady. There's no other way around it. It was like the freak show fat lady.
Yeah, I have a suspicion because part of the film explores her and her husband Mark taking photos of her weight gain progression. I suspect that it was just a photo that he had taken of her, which in fairness means that, you know, this was not a direction given by the documentary, but an active choice made by them based on a shot taken by Mark of Gina, which I believe we see this mirrored on near the end of the documentary. They describe it as what's meant to be her last day of mobility, last day of walking. So I can only imagine that perhaps what's forming the smile on her face is a sense of exhaustion from having had to be physically mobile and any other number of factoids. But you don't get that context until the end of the film, and we're only extrapolating that, being viewers who are like in the fucking know. When you're a civilian watching this, you just see a circus freak. And that's very fucking apparent. So yeah, I agree with your sentiments on that sort of initial premise being projected.
Well, you know, something else that struck me within the first couple of minutes of the film, I was like, this is very clear. It's extremely obvious that a man was directing it, because she is held in the male gaze, even though she is not the body type or weight that I think the director would go after. He is framing her in the same gaze as her husband does.
Yes.
You know, like in that exploitative, like you are a fantasy kind of way.
Very much agree. Throughout the film, and this woman, Gina, is not the only plus size woman who gets interviewed. Though, to be clear, the documentary is called Fat Girls and Feeders, so it does lean into this cishet normative idea that it's only fat women and it's only thin men, which obviously we know is not the case, but that's being left behind for this episode, so we're just going to have to get into it. Any instance in which a fat person is being filmed, they're never being like sat and looked at straight on, except for Gina, right? Every other character is either
Hmm.
naked or like in a bra and panties. And there's like one scene in particular I noticed where like two women are like bunched up on the tail end of the bed, like on their elbows, titties pressed, bellies out. They look naked because you can barely see the spaghetti straps that they're wearing. And then one of the characters, because
Hmm.
this is like when they finally reveal that what they're really talking about is feeders, they're like, yeah, it's like really
Hmm.
inappropriate what they do, and it's a game to them, and they take advantage of fat women, and they have no humanity for fat women. While the documentary is literally objectifying these fat women. So it's like, no matter how you want to slice
Yep.
it, this is advantageous over fat women. This very documentary is subjecting fat women, and it's not good. And my God, I don't know if anyone actually fucking saw that, but that's just a point to be made of the kind of shit we saw. There's a point in the beginning, right, to kind of take it back, where the narrator
Hmm.
describes FA, which is fat admiration, as a strange sexual subculture that treads the line between consent and coercion. In your opinion, do you feel like this statement confirms a bias in the piece?
No, absolutely. It's bias. It's bias. It's obvious. The fact that they even said that like, okay, first of all, they said strange sexual subculture. They didn't say different. They didn't say
Unique,
counterculture. They didn't say unique.
misunderstood.
They just said strange. So already they're classifying this entire sexual realm as being weird, unusual, and then goes on to say toes the line between consent and coercion, as in, like, I'm glad that they brought consent into it, but then when you balance that out with the coercion part, it's like, I what you're really trying to say here is that we're all just a bunch of deviant perverts.
Yeah, there's no real moment in the film where it explores the idea of consent, except towards the end. And at that point, there's this suggestion like, oh, some people say that they are consenting to this, but it can be hard to determine. And the reasons they insinuate that it is hard to determine whether or not the consent that is being given is legitimate is because it's apparently a slippery slope due to emotional manipulation and the extremes people go to not lose a partner. To which I say, maybe if we didn't have to deal with fucking systemic fat phobia, where the idea of being sexual with fat people was seen as a freaky fetish, maybe we wouldn't have that narrative being so strongly attested. Maybe fat people would be able to be in long-standing relationships to the point where someone trying to subjugate you because of your fatness becomes the outlier rather than a subjective expectation.
There was not a single positive thing that had been reviewed in that community for this documentary. And what I really hated about her statement of, oh, well, it's just so hard to know. It's like, okay, so you're just assuming that people are sheep who have no autonomy, no will. Like, it very much plays, and especially because there are two women that are featured as like the feedees. It's like she's saying, well, these two women just have no willpower. They're just weak and stupid,
Yeah.
and they're easily manipulated, and men are predatory, and they always have been and they always will be. And if he can't, rape her physically, this is how he's raping her. That's what I took away from that. And I'm like, what the fuck?
It's
Like,
It's once again an example to be made that it's a piece that doesn't actually seek to understand feedism or gaming, it just wants to point the finger. Because once again, so much of the perspective of fat liberation, which is an important movement, people, we need to get on board with it, But this division, this idea that gaining and feedism is somehow in opposition because the apparent belief of fat liberation is that women are weak and powerless and have no consent to the construct of being fat. You're only allowed to be fat if you hate yourself and have been bullied in order to become fat. Like, the idea that people could become fat out of joy and desire is insane to people. And, like, I get it, this is what we're combating. But, like, for anyone listening who is not a part of the community, this is what we're trying to pick apart. Like, there is a quintessential wrong thought in fat liberation if this is fat liberation's genuine perspective on gaining and feedism. It is factually wrong. And we can tell you that it is factually wrong. We are here to correct that narrative. Hence why, once again, I will say and scream from the top of my lungs, from the top of this building, what we are doing on this podcast is extremely fucking important because apparently no one else in the universe is talking about this. So, anyways, James on his soapbox once again. During the film, we're introduced to Mark, who is Gina's husband. And he says at the very beginning, when I was about 12 or 13 years old, realizing things weren't normal with me, I'd see a fat girl and I'd realize I'm getting turned on. Do you feel like this sentiment is, do you feel like part of how this sentiment is delivered indicates that perhaps his speech is scripted?
Well, I'm sure that the director came over and asked him, okay, so what are you gonna like tell me? Like, we're gonna do the run through. I'm gonna ask you the question, you answer it. I guarantee you the director was like, okay, let's tweak your answer a little bit. I'd like you to say it like this. You know, documentaries, I know the whole purpose of a documentary is to be fair and unbiased, but that is not the case. Documentary makers put their own spin on things. A documentary can be just as biased as anything else can. It is not like a news report. And hell, the longer we live, the more we figure out that the news is manipulated too. So,
speaking from experience, she took part in a documentary, and my experience from that is that they are honest with the idea of what they want to present, the overarching theme. But in terms of specific language and specific things, oftentimes that comes about because of questions that get asked. In my experience, I do not feel that the questions I was asked were particularly deceptive. But I can be honest and say that there are perhaps ways that questions are phrased that might suggest, oh, it would position you and pivot you slightly. You know, as much as if you can think physically, like you're standing, maybe you're leaning way onto your right foot, they'll ask you a question that causes you to pivot and just lean on the left foot. And that's all they're doing to position you to give a different answer, and that answer might have the same theme and flavor, but the specific language used hits more onto points that perhaps they want you to give. For example, like suggesting that when you were 12 or 13, you knew that you weren't normal. That to me is a very specific response given in response to perhaps a very specific question asked by the interviewer. So
we've also all felt that way. Every gainer, encourager, belly admirer, muscle gainer, belly enthusiast, whatever label you put yourself under in this community, every single one of us has felt that way. At some point we thought, oh, this isn't normal.
Yeah.
And that sucks. That fucking sucks, because that just puts a complex in your head. Because nobody ever pulls you aside and says, no, it's fine. It is normal. It's just who you are. It's just society has not, yet caught up and figured out that we can live and let live. Part of me really wanted to feel bad for Mark for feeling that way at that age, but we'll get to the points later on in this discussion where suddenly I was like, I don't think either one of these people are good people.
Oh, 100%. And I feel like this is the point. Like, we're just going to state this. The narration is manipulative. I mean,
yes, like, absolutely.
From the very beginning, walking the line between consent and coercion. It turns out this person was a feeder, a devious individual. It's not neutral language that allows the interviewee to express who they are. It is laced with bias from beginning to end. So if any of you end up checking this out, and to be clear to you, it is available in full to watch on YouTube if you would like to watch this. Please be aware that it has that, and if you find that triggering, be aware of that going in, because Christ, it's difficult to swallow. Right. The next kind of beat in the film, they introduce us to a British FA named Tony. Now, we both mentioned this to each other at the same time. Every angle that the fat admirers or feeders are filmed at is problematic. As in, there's no moment where they are filmed straight on, seated, dressed, and in full view of the daylight. Any moment you see this person, Tony, who, in all honesty, at first I actually felt myself thinking this person looks a little skeevy the way they're designed. But then you see him in the wide for a half a second, and you're like, oh, he's actually a very attractive guy.
Yeah.
So what they fucking had to do to this dude to put him on par with Mark, who, fulfills some stereotypes perhaps because of his generalized aesthetic. This guy Tony, they got him where it's like they're only filming him in the dark, or where it's like where the angle of the camera is like on a diagonal,
Or
like
it's like at one point the camera seemed to be under his
up his
chin,
nose,
and it was staring up his
up
nose,
his
and
fucking.
it was I was like, what the fuck is this angle? Who videos anything from this angle? I mean, this is not how an interview should be conducted. Like, if I had been Tony sitting there, I'd be like, why are you putting the camera down here?
The only moments you see him in the wide are the moments where he's at this BBW event, where he's dancing around with BBWs, doing jello shots with them and having a great time. But also, you see so much of it cropped and cut, these like little flash shots, where very clearly it's like when you see him looking quote unquote crazy, he's obviously like out of his fucking mind, horny, and having the time of his life with his community. Like, the idea that this is the moment to capture him looking insane, it's just very clear that there is a lot of that manipulative kind of bullshit, and there's odd camera angles
Yeah.
all throughout the documentary, not just him.
Well, yeah, because I wanted to bring up two other shots that I was just like, what are they doing?
I was
There
just,
was another there was another feedie who was introduced named Debbie.
ugh,
And they went through her story about how she had met a feeder and actually was subjected to a lot of psychological and physical abuse
which we will
through
say
this
here
guy.
is we don't stand, we don't support psychological
Yeah,
abuse,
we don't stand that.
sexual feedism, feeding, gaining any of it is still non-consensual, it's still not good, and it is never and will never be okay. Just putting that out there.
But they have this one shot where so they start in super close on one of her eyes, right? Like, the camera is pulled in so tight, and you actually see the really shitty job she did with her mascara.
Oh my god, it was so shitty.
But then yeah, it was really bad. But then they pull out, and it's a slow drawing the camera outwards to get her in, full frame, and she's just staring at the camera like with her mouth open and her eyes like hooded as if she's like a goldfish gasping for air. I was like, what kind of direction did he give her when he said, okay, this is how I'm going to frame the shot? Like,
Like, it was just like dead behind the eyes, honestly. And there was so many moments like that in the production where it just felt like they waited until these women were like gasping for air or having a sugar crash, and they just got shots of them looking like they were ready to pass out. It just, ugh. It was really,
but
yeah, it was really just, yeah.
but nothing tops the final shot of the film.
Oh my
Oh
God.
my God. So Gina, the woman that has been featured the most often in this documentary, and her husband Mark, they are both on the couch. Gina's sitting up, Mark is laying down, and he's like asleep, and his head is in the crook between like her love handle and
Breast.
her breast. So it's like it forms this nook, and he's just asleep. And then they pan over to Gina, who is staring at the camera with the most sour expression she could possibly muster on her face. And it's like, and it's just so weird. He's like asleep on her lap like a dog, and she's staring at the camera like an old Kathy comic strip, or like a moment from Daria, and then it just ends.
As they play, sometimes it's hard to be a woman. And it's like, what is this narrative? Like, oh my God.
I said to you, I'm like, what the fuck is this shot? Who what the fuck?
It's weird. It's a weird way to end it. I mean, look, I will say something here. Like, I wanted to like Mark throughout the film
I
because
did too.
it was very clear that he was a feeder and wanted to grow Gina. And I'll be honest, There's a lot of language from Gina throughout the film where she seems playful with the notion that she knew that he wanted to grow her. So there's a large portion of this film where it just feels like, well, maybe she didn't know that she enjoyed being a big person, but after she met Mark, maybe she realized, oh, this is actually something I can feel good about and I actually really enjoy doing. And so there's videos of her saying, I really enjoyed doing this for you guys, and blah, 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 blah. And it's not until like the fucking end of the film where she's like, yeah, so anyways, I was just doing all this to placate him, to make him happy, and now I regret everything.
That was the moment that I realized that both Mark and Gina are assholes.
So Mark states, I've never met a woman who was too big or too big for the fantasy, that's for sure. So regardless of the themes proposed in the films, how should we, as viewers who are in the know, take his statement as an indicator of his perspective on his spouse?
See, when he says, I've never met a woman that's too big for the fantasy, that makes me think that, like, you're living in the fantasy, dude. You're not living in reality. Like, I understand that there are people in our community who are death feeders and they want to be fed to the point of death. And I don't have an issue with that. The but if the partner, the one who's going to be facilitating all the care for said person, said, oh yeah, because I just can't stop fantasizing about him getting bigger and bigger and bigger, yada yada. It's like, okay, but at some point reality is going to have to set in. Even if the two of you still come to the consensus that you're going to feed him until he dies, you have to go through the reality of it. You have to understand the logistics of it. And in fact, one thing I wanted to bring up is the reason why I wanted to like Mark was because he made a video about how to care for someone who is of extreme size. And I actually was like, okay, I can give you your flowers for that because that's more than what most people do. You know, there's plenty of people that make content being at, extreme sizes, but then there's no education or reality into how they would be cared for. I actually think that
Yeah.
what Mark did making that video was a good thing.
It's a little bit like what we do, in all honesty, like trying to create resources that people can fucking refer to. So I feel like even in that moment, there must be some good, there must be some good intent because it's wanting to help facilitate things for others who I would presume are consenting. I mean, I feel like there's also a point to be made, right? Like this idea that we're suggesting that fat people can never consent to feedism. But like, how are we as feed people supposed to know that? Like, I am clearly a consenting gainer because I'm growing myself. And if I partnered with someone in the community who says they're a feeder or says they're a mutual gainer, why would I not believe them? I feel like it presents this dichotomy of everything's true until it's not true, and somehow you're supposed to know the difference at all times. Like, no, that's
Yeah,
just
like you're supposed to have this infallible barometer about when people are being genuine or not. Like, I get it that, like, you're supposed to really know someone before you get into a committed situation with them,
yeah.
but 90% of the population does not do that.
There's a point to be made. They do say in the documentary that Mark and Gina were together for less than a year before they got married. And I would imagine that, like, even some of the other situations where people found themselves in dangerous situations, like, they probably didn't know the people that long. They'd probably never met them in person. And maybe you'd argue, well, she couldn't leave the house to find out. Okay, and? Like, there's no other magic rule that determines how you're supposed to get to know someone. Like, people are going to make whatever decisions they want to make. There is a point in the film where the language used by fat admirers indicates a lack of sensitivity towards the description of plus size bodies. So, for example, he's talking about taking care of Gina, and he says, well, there's a part of his skin where it becomes like an inch thick. It's so leathery, it's like an elephant skin. And, that's a little insensitive to a big degree. But I want to ask you, in your opinion, do you feel like the language we have around growing bodies in the community has improved in the 20 years since this documentary was made?
I think so, but I mean, case by case, I'm sure there are people who still do use terms that are a bit more insensitive or lack of creativity. Some people are not very eloquent and they can't really come up with good metaphors. So in Mark's case, he probably just couldn't think of a better more
way of
flattering description,
talking about it.
you know. And there are people, like, again, we have members in our community who do get off on the humiliation aspect of it, so they might want to be compared to things like, it's just it's nuanced and it's case by case.
There is a moment I want to talk about where, again, they're talking about feeders, sorry, and they express a sense of confusion because they're like, I just don't understand how they convince feedies to overconsume. And it's like, that's another key thing where it's like, they just don't believe that consensual feedism actually exists. They don't understand that people can want this for themselves. So the entire narrative of this film predicates itself on the idea that to be fat or to want to be fatter is insane, it's bad, it's a mental disability to an extent, because they talk about how women who have been subjugated to this become mentally changed by this situation. They were talking about Debbie, she'll never be the same again, she's never fully recovered. Like, it's just insipid. This presentation of who and what we are, it's really fucking tough to watch, guys. I know we've said that, but fuck, just be ready. It does draw a line between FAs and feeders in a way that suggests like feeders are the wolf in sheep's clothing that infiltrates fat admiration and it corrupts BBWs. How much do you see that in the gainer community versus this suggestion of it?
I think that statistically, feeders like that must exist. However, I do not believe that they are in the percentage that this documentary would make you believe that they are in. Yeah. I think that they are probably, a subgroup of the regular, a subgroup of a subgroup kind of situation. Yeah. Like, I think that the main narrative being pushed in the community now is don't violate anyone's consent.
Yeah.
Coercion is not a good thing. No means no. And move the fuck on. Like, if somebody doesn't want to be your fantasy, which can you blame anyone for not wanting to be put under that kind of pressure? Then move the fuck on.
There are 50 million other people. We've said this before. It's like when people steal content of non-gainers and try to pass it off as their own, or they harass non-gainers on YouTube or on different profiles. And it's like, baby, there are thousands of gainers who want your love and affection. We want your attention on our bellies. Tell us we look fantastic. You don't need to go to non-gainers. You don't need to sneak around. You can literally find us, honestly, a dime a dozen in the community begging for that attention. Like,
well, and don't be devious. And honestly, let me put it like this. Okay, if you happen to be a person who wants that whole thing, the fantasy, the coercion, the convincing, the yada yada, be upfront about it. Say, hey, look, I'm not looking for a relationship. I'm not looking for commitment. I'm not looking for anything but fulfilling my fantasy.
Yep.
At least tell people up front. Tell people up front about that. So that way the feedee is informed and is like, okay, I can get in on this or I could not get in on this.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you that there are people out there who want to do this, who want to fulfill the fantasy for you that way.
Oh,
but you've got to go find the right people. This is the kind of harassment that people like that give to gainers and feedees within the community is what pushes them away and makes them say, I have to leave this community because I can't handle this.
100%. Look, there is such a thing as consensual non-consent, because rape fantasy, guys, hilarious. We are not unfamiliar with this concept that, like, oh, no, don't take advantage. Don't force me to do this. Oh, God, I don't enjoy this at all. Like, obviously, there are ways to enjoy it and that there are people who enjoy it. Just connect with those people. Don't, like, go about doing this shit the wrong way.
And there are safe ways to enjoy it without interacting with anybody at all. There's tons of fiction out there.
Lots of fiction. So much fiction. Yeah. Also, I just want to put it out there. The narrator insinuates that the feedist use of funnels for feeding is insidious, which completely ignores like what must clearly be the greater propensity of people to use those funnels for piss play, scat fetish, and putting fuel in your car. Like, Yes, the use of funnels is unique to. No, it's not unique.
No,
Stupid
it's
fuck.
just so it's such a stupid thing to even. I mean, because like, you know,
The
obviously funnels ended up being used for tube feeding and for piss play and all the other things because somebody saw or was working on a car, mechanic, whatever, saw the funnel, was like, I could strap that to a hose and then I could make an entire piece of headgear that would go, it's necessity is the mother of invention, but
um,
it's not as if feeders and gainers were the first people to ever think of using it for that,
no. If anything, we've covered in how many fetish episodes? Like, we think to ourselves, our kinks are so weird and unique, no one could ever understand. And then, plot twist, literally anything we've ever done is
has
just
already been done.
it's just the gainer flavor of literally pre-existing communities that are like millions of human beings strong. So truly, we are not the first, we will not be the last. Period. To deviate slightly, and I know I mentioned this before, like they're the two directors, right? They've both worked together on other projects since this, such as Notorious and Big Life, and many other documentaries and miniseries that have like aired on Channel 4, right? And so that's Alastair Cook and Robert Davis. Checking out the sort of synopsis of a lot of these projects, they have a similar theme to each other of exposing like underground seditious behavior. Do you feel like this documentary is just another example of that?
Absolutely. It is exploitative. It is absolutely 100% exploitative. It is let's drag the freaks out and we'll charge 2 bits a gander. And
To do whatever. I want to ask you, like, having now seen this documentary, what do you feel like their motivation was for creating this?
exploitation, plain and simple.
Just straight up.
Exploitation.
Because I
Nothing else. Exploitation.
I will say this, I do feel like there is a reason why you only ever see things about gaining and feedism every few years, and it's because there's only a one trick pony that people know how to address it with, and they know that there's only so many times they can flog that horse before they have to wait for it to get back up so they can flog it again. It's like the fishing ground. You can't overfish, otherwise they all die and it goes away. Same thing here. I think that they did this because they noticed a gap in the market to talk about something that for them was an easy win. I think it's very easy for society to present anything to do with fatness as seditious and inappropriate and cringy and nasty and bad. And they just went ahead and did that. Like, they didn't even try to appear neutral. They just went straight out with calling us weird and calling us, like, inappropriate and all sorts of things. So, fuck them. I want to ask a challenging question here. Is there anything about the film you liked?
When I mentioned about Mark making the educational video about how to care for somebody at that size, I thought that was a positive thing. And that's literally the only thing that I've taken away from the film that was a good thing.
You know, I'm inclined to agree. It was the only good thing. And I genuinely thought for myself, like, this is the moment where it turns it around. This is the moment where we find out that he's working with the Fat Lib movement and he's pushing for change and it's all going great. No,
No.
things went downhill after that point. But for a shining moment, Mark
For
was,
1 second, I was like on Mark's side, and then
and
yeah,
then it went. Um, in contrast, what did you dislike about the film? Um,
absolutely everything.
yeah, I dislike that it was made.
Yeah, I dislike the fact that these two men thought that this was something that they could be proud of. I feel that this was a very mean spirited documentary. I feel that there was some cruelty intended here with the specific language that the narrator was using, the framing of the subjects, the camera angles, even the background music.
Oh God,
It just felt like this was meant to poke fun, you know?
I'd want to ask the question, what would you change about this film? Like
I wouldn't, just to unmake it,
yeah,
to not have it exist.
I would change it from existing. That's exactly what I would do with this. I give this film a 1 out of 10.
I'm going to be conservative. I'm going to say that this is a -1.
This is a negative 1 out of 10. I love that. I am going to give this a 1 out of 10 purely for the 3 minute scene in which Mark explained about wanting to create content to help educate. fat admirers and feeders. That is my one.
That wasn't enough to save the film for me. This was truly a film that if I could apologize to the world for it existing, I know I didn't make it, but I still feel like obligated to apologize that it even exists. So it's going to stay at a -1, and I'm really worried that we're going to watch something even worse than this.
I mean, we have a horror film called Feed on the list.
Yeah, I have a feeling that one's going to make it like a -10 potentially.
We'll just see how we get on. I stick by my 1. Tim gives it a -1. That still averages out at a 0, so
Yeah.
Hard Fat's at a 9, I think, because I gave it an 8, you gave it a 10. Everyone else got 0s across the board, so we're either at a 9 or a 0. There is no is no in between.
There's no in between at this point.
Christ. Listeners, if you have any suggestions, by the way, because we have a list that we have reviewed and, made addendums for to go through. If you have any suggestions for things that actually address like gaining, feedism, feederism, anything like that, please write in at thiccradio@gmail.com. Tim, darling, do you have any final points to make for this steaming shit turd pile?
Just if you really want to subject yourself to 45 very uncomfortable minutes, give it a watch. And
that's just on YouTube, guys.
Just be aware that it was made in 2003, and that doesn't excuse anything, but it does give you perspective on, what was considered acceptable back then.
Yeah. Now look, that's a fair point. It was 2003. We are about 20 years in the future. So things have improved. And okay, I want to close out with this. I think things are better now. And I live in the hope that listeners, potential filmmakers will just pull our fingers out and make our own shit. I feel like we're not going to get a good documentary until one of us makes one. Yeah. So I just want to put it out there. If anyone wants to make one, this is your God of whatever your religion speaking through me to tell you to get off your fat ass and please make it, because I'd like to review some good shit that talks about us for once. That would be nice.
If this entire list turns into a bunch of negative numbers and zeros, I'm just gonna be like, there's no hope. There's no hope.
Oh my god. Well, that's a wrap for now here on Thicc Radio. Thank fuck. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review, even though we gave this movie a bad review. If you like this episode, for God knows what reason, the podcast, we're good, or just us in general, share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me on Instagram and beefyfrat at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and beefyfrat at thickymouse. You can also look us up on TikTok at Thicc Radio or at our website at www.podpage.com/Thicc Radio. If you want to submit a voice note, you can reach us at anchor.fm/Thicc Radio/message. And if you have any questions or ideas for episodes, you can reach us at thiccradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Anchor app podcast produced by Stan and Thiccy Mouse.
Mixed and mastered by Stan.
Our artwork is provided by Lokitu.
Our theme song is provided by Spotify.